What kind of faith do we have? Is it something that's, if you will, for a lack of a better term, a fair weather faith? I mean, I reflect on this when I hear people say they've gone to church all their lives, their spouse gets stricken with cancer, they pray novenas, they pray all of this, nothing happens, their spouse dies, and they become embittered and they leave the church. Why? Because God didn't heal my spouse, or my mother, or my aunt, or my grandmother, or whatever. And because God didn't answer my prayers the way I wanted to, the way I expected him to, well, I'm just giving up on the whole thing. Have you ever known anyone like that? Yes. We're all shaking our heads. We know people like this. Let's bring it down a little bit more. How many people do we know that have left the Catholic Church for other Christian churches because fill in the blank?
Yes.
Yes.
What does that say about their Catholic faith? They had none, I would argue. They didn't know their faith. They simply didn't know their faith. So is this something that's very real? Yes. And I reflect on our Bible study here. How many people are here? 20, 30?
32.
Something like that? How many families are enrolled at St. Charles?
5,000 more.
Let's say 4,000. Let's be generous. Let's say 80% of them cannot come on Tuesday night because of work, family, inability, health, whatever reason. 80% of them. Right? How much is left over?
20%.
20% of 4,000?
800.
That's 800 people. Where are they? Not that I want them all coming to see me, mind you. That's not the point. That's not the point. The point I'm getting at, I hope you're getting, is that how many are investing in their faith by coming to things like this, going to the Sunday night evangelization, anything to better or enrich their faith, to know more about their faith, to get a better understanding, to share their faith. How many?
60.
Right? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So if persecution ever really did hit the church in America, and my brothers and sisters, as sure as I'm sitting here, I can tell you for sure it will. It will.
Mm-hmm.
It will. How many people are going to stand up and say, no? No. You cannot come into our churches and tell us what we can and cannot preach. How many will stand up for that? Or how many will passively go by and say, well, you know, the government's got a point. That is hate speech, you know. In other words, how much has the world influenced those who are supposedly in the church, and how much has the church actually influenced those in the world, is what I'm asking. I'll make a prediction right here, and call me a prophet and see if it happens. Within 10 years, you will see a government onslaught of private Christian and Catholic schools in this country.
It's already happening.
Chip, is it possible?
Within 10 years, you will see laws being passed to effectively close down public and Christian and Catholic schools in the United States.
I think we have a reversal actually now. I think more people are turning to religion than have in many years. We've had that, you know, Harvard and Yale were founded as Christian universities.
More than that, they were founded as divinity schools to train pastors.
Exactly, yes. But I think we're going back to it. I see it going reversing, actually.
I see it as a both and. I see a groundswell of faith of the faithful few, if you will, learning their faith, getting it together, seeing what's going on, seeing through the deception. And I also see a rise of the anti-clerical movements, especially in light of things like the cleric abuse crisis and other forms of for example, and the reason why I say this in America within 10 years is this: I look at Canada. You say, what's happening in Canada? Right now in Canada, it is illegal. Yes, look it up. It is illegal for a pastor or priest to preach anything against homosexuality from the pulpit because it's defined as hate speech. And hate speech is non-protected speech by the government. It's a crime. You understand that? It's a crime. And just because you're a religious institution doesn't give you the right to say that. I look at, because in the Canadian equivalent of the Supreme Court, they've ruled against and against any group, religious organization that does things like that. And you'd say, well, that would never happen here in the United States. We've got free speech. Baloney. 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 Don't fool yourself in thinking that we are immune from this. I predict within 10 years, mark it on your calendars, within 10 years, you will start to see legislation specifically targeting private Christian and Catholic schools under these kinds of auspices because they teach hate. That's how it will be marketed. That's how it will be labeled. That's how it'll be sold to the masses of the American people.
Well, I've seen it. I think we've seen some of it already, especially with this abortion issue, when they're trying to tell hospitals or the medical centers that you cannot allow this to happen. You know, we have a free choice and blah, blah, blah. And
Right.
we've seen that going already into the training systems already
Right.
signed.
Right.
And once the government allows this or condone it, then the other things are going to follow.
Right.
It's easy for it to follow.
Right. So I would say in this politically charged environment that we are in, to listen very carefully to the various politicians and their stances and what they are actually promoting before, and to make an informed decision according to that. I think it's very important that we not just sit idly by. We should certainly pray, and we should act accordingly.
So we should be brave in response when we see political correctness started it a long time ago.
Sure.
And we were cowards. We didn't dare speak
Right.
against political correctness.
Right. No, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment.
Sure.
This week, we've seen in the news about what Governor Newsom said about the death penalty.
Right.
And how he's against it.
Right.
And he has an interview, and they asked him, I think it's in The View, I have to be watching it. And he said, well, one of my children said, Daddy, do you want to kill people? And that's one of the deciding factor for him not to allow the death penalty. I don't know how true it is or if it's political or not political, but it's something that he had, you know,
What is the
broadcast.
stance on that?
On capital punishment? As a matter of historical precedent, the Catholic Church has acknowledged that the government has the right to execute criminals for capital, for its own purposes. Is it preferable? No. No. Because in general, the church stands for life, all life. But it acknowledges the government's prerogative to do it. Now, I think when one has to look at one of the earliest records of this, and this is St. Paul himself in the book of Romans. He talks about the government wielding the sword. Now, this is the same government that's going to wield the sword against him. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
So what he's doing is that he's acknowledging that God, in his wisdom, has granted the power or purview of government to be able to do this. He acknowledges that they're able to do this. Is it preferable by the church? No. We would prefer you not to kill even those who have committed the most heinous of crimes. Is it permissible for the government to do it? Yes. Is it permissible? Is it preferable in the church's mind? No. It's not preferable, but it's permissible. So it acknowledges. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that would be again contrary to, like, you say you're pro-life. I mean,
Some people see that as being not in keeping with pro-life, but it isn't. Because you go back to the Old Testament, and God prescribed capital punishment under the Old Testament law. So that permission has always been there. That permission has always been there. Is it preferable? No. Think of the woman caught in adultery. Moses' law says that we should stone her. What do you say? And what was his response? Who of you has no sin? Go ahead and throw it. Oh, right? So did he deny that that's what Moses prescribed?
No.
Is it permissible?
Yes.
Is it preferable?
No.
There's a higher law that should supersede, and the law is love. But it's always been a part of God's command from the time of Cain and Abel, that one who sheds one man's blood, his blood shall be shed himself. Okay? So capital punishment has been there since literally the dawn of time. Jesus has come and said, not that it wasn't against the law, but he said there's a greater law that can be applied here as well. Okay? You've had your hand up.
Well, just Jesus himself subjected himself to the law of government, Pontius Pilate. And he said, you have no power when not had already been given to you.
Correct. And I think that is the perspective that any good Catholic Christian must have, is to understand that the government is there because God permits it to be there. All government is there because God permits it to be there. Not just the good government that we like, but the evil government also. You say, oh, I don't believe that. Really? Who was Jesus speaking to when he said that? Pilate. What did Pilate do? Condemn an innocent man to death, right? Is he a good guy? No. But what did Jesus say? He acknowledged that it's not you, it's my Father in heaven that gives you this permission. St. Paul, when he wrote what he said about the government wielding the sword, who was the emperor at the time? Nero. Was Nero a good Christian politician? Far from it. But who put him in power? God did. Yes. See, we get too used in our modern American thinking to reading our values, our lenses into the Bible. We have to get into the Bible's perspective and understand what is happening. That was, if nothing else, those of you who were here during their study of Daniel, that was probably the number one thing I was hoping I could convey, is to get a spiritual perspective on earthly things. God's perspective is so much different than ours. We see that events are just happening haphazard. God, you know, there is no God. All these evil men are doing all these evil things, and you realize that God's in complete control of everything. 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 You realize that God is going to permit the Antichrist to come to power at some point and wreak havoc here on the earth, and to kill the saints that are here on the earth under his rule. You realize that? Why? Because it's part of God's plan. Do we know that plan? No. Can we trust that God knows what he's doing and that he is in ultimate control?
Absolutely.
Yes, that's what we're expected to do and know how to do. And the testing of evil men on the church is a winnowing process. It's to weed out all the fakes and the frauds and so forth from the real fodder. And I hope and pray to God that I am among the faithful when the time comes. I hope and pray that I am. That I not love my life so much here on earth as to shrink from death.
We hope we pray too.
I'm sorry?
Sounds like something we should pray for.
Yeah.
Yes, like starting our Bible study with prayer, huh? Let's do that.